So welcome back everybody to our first afternoon session, long-term perspectives. And before I start, I want to really congratulate all of you, to the speakers and especially the organizing committee for this, I think, truly remarkable conference, because I believe that all your presentations so far and the presentations we'll hear this afternoon till the end of the conference are really inspiring and will contribute to the field of Aegean archaeology in more ways than we at the moment can actually predict. So it's great to see this strong new research generation out there. Just as an aside, just to remind you, you may also write your questions during the presentations to the presenters, so they can read them immediately after their talk, and we can also perhaps structure the discussions accordingly. So don't bother to wait until the discussion, the final discussion. If you have a question, put it in the chat, and we would then refer to that and come back to that in the discussion. Thank you. And now let us start without further ado with the paper of Georgios Stergiou from the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens, and cultural practices of the Bronze Age Aegean societies as evidenced by chipped stone assemblages, the North-South debate revisited. Georgios, the floor and especially the screen is yours now.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I share the screen. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, it's full
screen.
Okay,
thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank the members of the organizing committee for letting me participate in this conference. This presentation focuses on the different cultural practices between the communities of the Northern and the Southern Aegean during the Bronze Age, as far as lithic technology and raw material procurement strategies are concerned. This presentation is part of my PhD research project, which focuses on the understanding of the Bronze Age societies of Central and Northern mainland Greece, Macedonia, Western Thessaly, Epirus, and Western Central Greece up to the district of Phokida, under the light of lithic technology. In these areas, the emerging societies of the Bronze Age exhibit characteristics that differentiate them from those developed in the Southern Aegean, where palatial systems emerged during the Minoan and Mycenaean period, and the trade of luxurious commodities existed during these periods. This research attempts, on the one hand, to provide a more complete picture of the material culture in this area, and on the other hand, to better understand the raw material distribution networks, the technological changes, and the economic organization of the Bronze Age settlements in intra and inter-regional level, taking into account the new research questions addressed in this region. The debate about the differences in material culture between these two areas starts early in the 20th century with the work of Walter Hertley. Hertley wants to remove the impression that Macedonia goes with the north by showing that Macedonia west of the Struma goes primarily with the Aegean. He also states that the region of Macedonia is isolated during the Bronze Age, and that this period of isolation ends in 600 BC with the first Corinthian Third at Tuba Vardarovca. This cultural and geographical divide between North and the South was the norm in archaeology for many decades, and this changed during the end of the last century, mostly after the excavations at Tuba Thessaloniki. As Kostas Kotsakis wrote in 1997, such a view of this boundary most probably leads to the essentialization and objectification of multidimensional phenomena, such as social organization or complexity, which neither have a stable content, nor as such are they necessarily always manifested in the same way. Today, the societies of Northern Greece are treated as active participants that exploit material culture in terms of social strategies, and not as passive recipients of culturally superior commodities and technologies, especially from the south. Furthermore, the region of Northern Greece is not an isolated area, as indicated by the presence of well-made Minoan pottery in Chalkidiki and Pieria, Mycenaean pottery in central Macedonia, obsidian from the island of Milos, and other forms of material culture from different areas of the Aegean. Chipped stone artifacts form a dynamic element in the reconstruction of the Bronze Age societies of the Aegean, as they provide us with useful information about the exchange systems of this period, the technological state of the societies, and the daily activities that took place inside the settlements. Since the 1960s, obsidian sources in Eastern Mediterranean were identified through chemical analysis by Colin Renfrew and his team, and since then, there has been a great amount of archaeological work in obsidian studies in the area. The focus on the procurement and use of obsidian plates in the Aegean resulted in the neglect of other raw materials that were also used during the Bronze Age, such as chert and flint, chalcedony and quartz. And what I mean by this term neglect is mostly the absence of systematic petrographic analysis on these raw materials. The study will concentrate on the production of the chipped stone artifacts only in a domestic context. This effort will be supported with archaeological data from Bronze Age sites located in the northern and the southern part of Greece, such as Toumba Thessaloniki, Valtos Leptokarias at the district of Pieria, Kyra at the district of Phokida, and Plasi Marathon at the district of Attica. Toumba was inhabited from the end of the early Bronze Age to the end of the late Bronze Age, as also the site of Kyra that was inhabited in most part of the Bronze Age period. The lithic assemblage from Kyra comes from the excavations that were carried out between 2009 and 2015, and the study of the material from the excavation of 2018 and 2019 is still in progress. Valtos Leptokarias is a middle and late Bronze Age site at the district of Pieria. And finally, the lithic assemblage from Plasi comes from the middle Helladic megaron that was excavated between 2015 and 2019. The methodology of the study follows the notion of operational sequence or champ opératoire. This approach includes the reconstruction of the exploitation stages of the raw materials, from the selection of the raw material until it is used and discarded as a tool, by positioning every single artifact in a stage of manufacture according to its technological attributes. As we can see in this table, there are major differences in the use of raw materials between the sites mentioned in this presentation. At Toumba Thessaloniki and Valtos Leptokarias, there are only 2 and 3 pieces of obsidian respectively. These are a small flake with a notch and a splintered piece of obsidian at the site of Toumba, and 1 flake and 2 mesial parts of blade at the site of Valtos. The majority of the knapped stone artifacts at these sites are made of local chert. On the contrary, at the sites of Kyra and Plasi, obsidian from the island of Milos prevails. The percentage is much higher at the site of Plasi. The question is whether this difference between the northern and the southern part of Greece reflect distinct economic and social strategies, or it is just the result of an adaptation to a pre-existing cultural pattern. On Kyra and Plasi, obsidian is exploited for the production of bladelets with parallel edges and arises. The sharp edges were mostly used without retouch, probably for cutting activities inside the settlements. These are some blades from Kyra at Phokida and prismatic blades and splintered pieces from the site of Plasi. Splintered pieces are numerous at the site of at this site, and in this case they are products of bipolar percussion, probably with the use of an anvil technique. But the examination of the technological attributes of these pieces is still in progress. The technological study of the obsidian assemblages from Kyra and Plasi shows that the detachment of the blades from the core was accomplished by the use of the pressure technique. This means that pressure, instead of percussion, was exerted on the platform of the core with the use of a wooden tool equipped with metal or antlet tip. The pressure technique is an elaborate and often demanding technique that needs a lot of experience on behalf of the toolmaker in order to successfully reduce a blade core, and it is a technique that was widely used in the southern Aegean. The use of crests in order to initiate the blade production is a method that is also well known in the Bronze Age societies of the southern Aegean. One or more ridges are bifacially flaked on the face of the core to facilitate the removal of the first blade. The subsequent blades follow the two irises left by the removal of the crested blade, thus ensuring the regularity and success of the napping procedure. Crested blades are also found at Kira and Plasi. The presence of cortical flakes at the middle hellantic megaron at Plasi probably indicates that small obsidian nodules arrived at the settlement. At Kira, there is a great variety of chert artifacts, honey flint probably from northwest Greece, chocolate flint of the Pindus range, chalcedony, and other types of chert and flint. There are also numerous small pebbles of radiolite and black chert. Petrographic analysis on these types of chert will be carried out in order to determine the provenance of these siliceous materials. At Plasi, the percentage of chert artifacts is very low, only at 3%, and consists mostly of local chert or a few blades napped on various types of flint and mostly used as sickle elements. Chert artifacts at these sites were possibly used when obsidian was not available in some periods of time during the Bronze Age. At the site of Toumba in northern Greece, a local chert called siliceous limonite was used for the production of flakes, not blades, probably for use as cutting tools. These flakes were struck from discoid or prismatic cores, but with no standardized morphology, with no use of crests, or with no organized handling of the cores. After 4 or 5 removals, the core was abandoned and a new one was used for the production of flakes. Flakes were used as expedient tools, mostly with no retouch on their edges. The toolkit of the assemblage consists of limited types, mainly notched and denticulated pieces, pieces with linear retouch, and few perforators. The technique that was used for the detachment of the products from the core was the direct percussion technique with a hard hammer, possibly a stone, and this technique was applied during the entire process of manufacture. At Valtos Leptokarias, a black chert was used for the production of flakes. The technological attributes of the assemblage are the same with the lithic assemblage from Toumba Thessaloniki. Flakes were used expediently for daily activities in the settlement, mostly with no retouch and struck from small discoid cores. And there are also limited types of tools present in the assemblage, such as denticulated pieces, notched pieces, and some pieces with linear retouch. The predominance of flint and local chert in northern Greece and of Melian obsidian in central and southern Greece follows the Neolithic tradition. This is a map showing the distribution of Melian obsidian during the early Neolithic and the expansion of the distribution during the late Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Nevertheless, the main area that is directly linked to the procurement of obsidian from Milos, both in the Neolithic and the Bronze Age period, is the eastern part of central and southern mainland Greece, Crete, and the Cyclades. The use of more elaborate techniques in southern Greece for the production of blades during the Bronze Age does not mean that the societies of northern Greece are technologically inefficient. A major difference between the Neolithic and the Bronze Age lithic assemblages in northern Greece is that during the late and final Neolithic, there was a systematic production and exchange of large-sized blades napped on various types of flint of excellent quality. These blades were produced with the pressure or the indirect percussion technique, another elaborate technique for the production of such blades, and it has been stated that they were made by itinerant craftsmen. These blades were mostly used as elements in wooden sickles. This pattern changed during the early Bronze Age, when these blades were substituted by a different technology for the production of flakes, as we previously saw in the examples from the Toumba, Thessaloniki, and Valtos Leptokarias in Pieria. On the contrary, in the southern Aegean, the major difference between the Neolithic and Bronze Age obsidian assemblages is the more systematic use of the pressure technique during the Bronze Age for the production of the characteristic prismatic plates of this period. During the Neolithic period, obsidian blades were mostly produced through the use of percussion techniques and not pressure. In my opinion, the difference between North and South during the Bronze Age has to do with the different access to the sources of obsidian and chert. In the Southern Aegean, the procurement of obsidian was embedded in maritime travels, and obsidian from Milos was an exotic material for the people that were living outside the Cyclades. The access to obsidian sources was partly restricted, because not all the settlements would be capable of organizing maritime missions to the Western Cyclades for the acquisition of obsidian and metal. It is possible that itinerant craftsmen were participating in these missions and had control of the obsidian manufacturing processes. Furthermore, pressure is not only an elaborate technique, but also a means of economizing raw material, because it uses the entire volume of the core instead of a percussion technique. On the contrary, the people of the northern part of Greece had no direct access to the sources of obsidian, so they used mostly local chert for the production of their tools. The sources of chert are numerous in mainland Greece and existed in the vicinity of the settlements. And probably there was an unrestricted access to these sources. So there was no need to invest in a demanding and elaborate technique in order to acquire products with sharp edges for the daily activities inside the settlements. Finally, the adoption of common agricultural practices in both areas during the end of the 3rd millennium BC is an example of a technological choice that was widely accepted by all the Bronze Age societies of mainland Greece. The Bronze Age in mainland Greece is characterized by the presence of a particular type of tool of quadrangular, orthogonal, or subtriangular shape, with covering retouch and serrated edges, which spans from the end of the early Bronze Age to the end of the late Bronze Age. These tools are often characterized as sickle elements due to the presence of distinctive gloss on their working edges, a highly lustrous sheen that is formed by the contact of the tool with the silica-rich stems of cereal grasses. These tools were possibly hafted in wooden sickles and have a much different morphology than the Neolithic sickle elements that were nabbed on large-sized blades. These tools are found, as we see in the pictures, in great quantities at the Bronze Age sites of northern and central Greece, but they are also found in the south, in Peloponnese, and also in Crete and Cyclades during the Middle and late Bronze Age. Here's a picture from the publication of Hardenbergen and Lanners from 2001 on these flakes, these sickle elements on flakes from Lerna in Peloponnese. In conclusion, the contrast between the lithic assemblages of the north and the south during the Bronze Age reflect two radically different social and economic strategies: obsidian from Milos on the one hand and local chert on the other hand, with different techniques. Of course, local chert was also used by the societies of the southern Aegean to a much lesser degree, probably in order to compensate for the shortage of obsidian during certain periods during the Bronze Age. The choice of these strategies was affected by the available raw materials, the morphology of the landscape, the technological state of the societies, and the cultural and historical context. Finally, I want to thank my supervisor, Georgios, for your guidance throughout my PhD, Associate Professor Yannis Papadatos and Anthropology for allowing me to study the lithic assemblage from the Middle Helladic Megaron at Plasi, Associate Professor Rafaelos Zelet for allowing me to include the lithic assemblage from Kira in my PhD, Professors Stelios Andreou and Sevi Triantafylou from the Aristotle University of Thessaloniki and excavators of the site of Toumba, and finally Sofia Koulidou from the Ephorate of Antiquities of Pieria and excavator of the site of Valtos. Last but not least, the research work was supported by the Hellenic Foundation for Research and Innovation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Jorgo, for this lucid paper and also for absolutely keeping in time. So we will come back to you in the discussion. The next paper is going to be presented by Dimitris Papageorgiou, and may you unshare your screen, Jorgo? Thank you. Yeah. And is on tracing the distribution of Philistine hearths type and construction methods through space and time. So, Dimitri, thank you for sharing. We don't see your full screen yet. Yeah, super. I think it's coming up. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much. Hello to everyone. And first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference for the opportunity to present my study here. And many congratulations for all their effort in the organization of the conference. So let's start the presentation. Philistine hearths in the case of southern Levant have for a long time been considered as a new element brought in by the sea people. Earlier studies have identified similarities of this type of hearth with examples from the Aegean. These similarities were usually used as a proof of migration from the Mycenaean world to southern Levant, but also to other regions like Cyprus. In the most recent article focusing on this topic, Meyer and Hitchcock argued that Philistine hearths find their closest similarities in examples from Cyprus and Crete. However, in many studies, precise chronological correlations of the strata in which the hearths were found are lacking, failing to track geographically and temporally the evolution of hearths based on their construction methods. This methodological gap has created confusion about the nature and the process of this cultural innovation, not only in the southern Levant, but also in Cyprus and the northern Levant. In this presentation, a revaluation of all the available evidence is attempted. Through this study, the phenomenon of the cultural transmission or imitation of this type of hearth in the Eastern Mediterranean during the 12th and 11th century BC will be studied, not as part of a whole set of clear-cut defined cultural traits like Mycenaean type pottery, etc., that appeared in many sites during the 12th century BC. These traditional approaches presenting cultural packages that have been transmitted from one region to another were widely adopted in the past. On the contrary, the focus of this study is mainly in the structural and functional characteristics of these architectural features and their relation to the practices performed with the use of hearths, mainly cooking. Inside this framework, other traits of material culture, such as cooking pots, were taken into consideration. The main effort here is to reconstruct the practices related to the phenomenon of technological transfer of the hearth's construction through time in different regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. In an attempt to define the Philistine hearth based on the existing data from the whole Eastern Mediterranean, and especially the Aegean, it is difficult to reach a whole-out definition. This is due to the great variation in the shape, construction techniques, and materials employed. A less clear-cut definition is formulated here, which includes all the basic characteristics of these firing installations. Under this spectrum, Philistine hearth is a built firing installation of circular or rectangular form with a flat top surface at the same level or a little bit higher than the floor surface. Based on these characteristics, a categorization of different types of hearths is utilized in this study according to differentiations in the construction methods employed in each hearth. Firing installations with these basic characteristics are rare in Cyprus and Levant during the later stage of Late Bronze Age, where ovens and fire pits predominate. For this reason, the term Aegean type hearth is adopted in this study to refer to this kind of firing installations as an indicator for the origin of its technological aspects from the Aegean area, where similar hearths have a long-standing tradition during the whole Bronze Age. In an effort to trace the development of the Aegean type hearth, a separation of the data into two periods is adopted. In the case of the Levant and Cyprus, most of these hearths have been unearthed in strata dated to the 12th and to 10th century BC. Hearths dated in the same period from the Aegean are taken into account, especially from the early stage of the late Helladic pre-C period. However, in order to search for similarities and differences in the examples appeared in the Eastern Mediterranean from the 12th century onwards, the focus of this study should also be placed in the directly preceding period. Hearths in the Aegean area dated to the previous period, namely the 14th and 13th century BC, were also reviewed in the present study. Clear chronological separation of the hearths found in every site and region is a critical aspect of this study, which focus on the development of the Aegean type hearth and the transmission of certain traits from one region to another. A second methodological consideration appointed here is the focus of previous research on ceremonial hearths found in palatial context as comparative material. The extra-palatial hearths in settlements of the wider Aegean area have been generally neglected by most scholars. According to this view, only people connected to and with a deep knowledge of the palatial way of life could have taken part in the process of technological transfer of construction techniques. In this study, this approach is rejected. Every hearth found within the limits of settlement was recorded, both from buildings inside the palatial citadels and extra-palatial settlements, in an effort to gain a more complete insight of the topic. Through the following synthesis, an interregional comparison will become possible, creating a clearer picture of technological choices, possible technological interconnections, and transfer of ideas. Hearths in the form of a low clay platform extending above the floor, as the hearth 4 in the sanctuary of the ingot god Atenkomi, or the example from Askelon in room 25, both dated to the 12th century BC, or another example in building complex 1 of Telchoukas, dated to the Iron Age 1, are widespread in mainland Greece also, with some of the examples dated much earlier in the late Helladic 3A period, in Nihoria and Myklena in Mycenae, and others dated to the late Helladic 3B period, as the cases from Mycenae. In the case of the hearth of room Z of building 2 in Tel Kazel, in Temenos A in Kition, and some specimens from the Philistine sites of Ekron and Askelon, the hearths were made of a stone bed covered with clay or plaster, all dated to the 12th century BC. Even if the hearths found in Korakus houses L and P, with a mixed bedding of sherds and pebbles, seems exaggerated to be related, however, the basic concept behind its layout remains the same. The hearths in the form of a low platform with a bed made only of sherds have also the same layout, as these found in the sanctuary of the ingot god Atenkomi, in many examples in NeoPalatial, and the site of Ekron and Askelon in Philistia. They resemble hearths in Pyrins, Korakou, Chania, Lefkandi, and Ornekastelos in Crete, with some of the examples dated as early as late Helladic or late Minoan 3B period. Another variation of the same general type of the low platform hearth is the one paved with stone slabs, as the rectangular hearth in Enkomis area 3 that find good parallels in the central placed hearth found in the Megaroid building Z at Aegean Konstantinos at Methana, dated to the late Helladic 3D period, and the site of Ornekastelos in Crete, dated to the late Minoan 3C early period. In a second big categorization according to their construction and shape, there are hearths with a frame made of stones and or mud brick. One such example is the hearth in the corner of room 19 of NeoPalatial, which was framed by a mix of stones and mud bricks. Similar hearths were discovered in a room of the shrine complex in Medea, and in Mycenae in room 11 of the temple complex, and room 31 of the house with the fresco. The case of the stone-framed hearth found in NeoPalatial in room 49, whose interior was covered with sherds, it is similar with the hearth of room E in Chania, dated to the late Minoan 3B2 period. Similar in form and construction method is also the hearth from room 910 in Askelon, dated to the early 11th century BC. The same is true for the hearth of room H of building 2 in Tel Kazel, or the hearth from Pilakotinokrinos in site, which is identical with the hearths in Aegean Konstantinos at Methana and Chania with a stone frame, and the bed consisted also of stones and pebbles. A different type of hearth, the pebble hearth, is characteristic of the interior of Philistia, as the examples from Ekron and Gath show. As was observed, pebble hearths were usually placed in open areas, in contrast to the coastal Philistine sites where other types of hearths were located inside large halls or smaller rooms. Some scholars proposed that this differentiation may be part of a differentiation in practices performed in each region, as the open area could host larger communal gatherings with feasting activities, while the indoor hearths in the coastal sites were probably part of a system of restriction of access. Based on that, hearth construction and placement suggest strong regionalism in Philistia, with the sites of Gath and Ekron comprise one group and another one in the coastal sites of Asdod and Askelon. However, in this point of view, there are some factors that were not taken into account. First of all, despite previous claims that the specific type of hearth is missing in the Aegean area, they seem to be present as early as the 13th century BC in the site of Kalamathka in Crete, where a layer of pebbles was laid on the floor without any additional element. Also, in Ekron, other types of hearths were found inside buildings and were quite similar with the hearths in the other Philistine sites dated to the 12th and early 11th century BC, in a central position framed by columns and consisted of a bed made of stone or certs covered with clay. In contrast, the pebble hearths found in Ekron and Gath are dated in the second half of the 11th and early 10th century BC. Although, whether this type of hearth was based on the Cypriot prototypes, such as these from Mount Paleocastro, as Meyer and Hitchcock indicated, or examples from the Aegean, there is a wide chronological span of at least 1.5 centuries between them and the Philistine examples. A more possible explanation for the presence of this type of hearth could be the local evolution of the Aegean type hearths. Hearths with pebble bed either on a clay low platform or in a framed hearth have a wide distribution in the area, as was shown above. The pebble hearths have the same basic characteristics, but in much simpler construction pattern, with a length of pebbles in a shallow pit, without a fringe made of stones or clay, or covered with a clay layer. As long as pebble hearths seem to be a cultural trait of late date in Philistia, and its basic characteristics could be observed in other earlier forms of hearth found in most of the Philistine sites, then the proposed assumption of a local evolution for this type of hearth seems quite possible. Another point that I would like to emphasize before proceeding to the general discussion and the conclusions is that in the area of North Levant coast, no example of Aegean type hearth has been mentioned till this day. However, I suggest that there are indications in some sites that such features existed during the early Iron Age, and these examples are presented here for the first time. In the site of Tel Kazel, two possible examples dated to the early 12th century BC could be extracted through the information in the preliminary reports of the excavations. One framed hearth with pebble and stone bed in room H of building 2, and one in the form of a low clay platform with pebble bed in room Z of the same building. In the site of Tel Sukas, 3 hearths were found in total dated to the Iron Age 1. A large rectangular built hearth was placed in an alley, and 2 hearths were found inside the rooms of 2 building complexes. A circular hearth with a bed made of stones laid against the wall, and a low clay platform hearth was found in central position. Unfortunately, photos and detailed plans for all of these examples are still lacking. However, the description of these features is rather characteristic and comes in contrast to other local types of firing installations like the ovens. Of course, a more detailed study of these features is needed. As is evident from the above presentation, hearths present great variability in terms of construction methods and shape. This observation comes in contrast to other firing installations like the ovens, which are rather stable, especially in Cyprus and Levant, where they are more widespread in use during late Bronze and early Iron Age. This variability creates a difficulty in the attempt to find interconnections relied on specific characteristics. In the opposite direction, we could not argue that the hearth in general, as an architectural feature, by itself support a link with the Aegean. Aegean-type hearths seem to introduce some new traits that are unknown previously in many regions of the Eastern Mediterranean. This could be summarized in the following observation. First of all, Aegean-type hearths have a built firing surface in the form of a platform or an enclosure where the firing process is taking place. The surface is usually flat when it's covered with clay, stone slabs, or just making use of the floor surface. In many cases, hearths present a bed made of shells, stones, or pebbles below the clay surface. In other cases, the surface is somewhat irregular when it's directly laid with stones or pebbles. The second basic characteristic is the process of open-air firing. The fuel is placed on top of the firing surface and not inside a closed space like the oven. Heating is mainly affecting the sides of the cooking pot, which could be moved on the hard surface around the heat source and not directly on top of it. This is evident by the appearance of heat marks on the sides of the body of the Aegean-type cooking pots, namely cooking jugs or amphorae with flat or ring bases. The contemporary appearance of such pots in most sites where Aegean-type hearths have been found is connected to these traits. Based on their basis shape, they could not be used in the local tradition ovens where only the local tradition cooking pots could fit. Their concave bottom fit in the top opening of the ovens or directly into the fire in a pit. Flat or ring-based Aegean-type cooking pots could only be used on the flat surfaces of the Aegean-type hearths. However, there are local tradition hearths in some sites of Cyprus and Levant, which present similar characteristics but are not included in the Aegean tradition. For example, in the hearths found in Scipio, which comprise a P or U-shaped enclosure on the floor, could have also been used Aegean-type cooking pots placed next to the open side of the hearth. The choice of a different kind of hearth, as the example from Paleocasto in the slide, in which the practice of cooking could be performed in an almost identical way, maybe resemble a differentiation in the habitual practices employing a different hearth in terms of shape and construction, which may have a specific significance for the users. This observation is related to the discussion concerning the ritual use and ideological meaning of these architectural features. The ritual meaning of Aegean-type hearths in the Eastern Mediterranean, even if states true for some of the examples, is based on a limited range of data. Many of them have been also found in corners against walls and in non-central position inside rooms. Namely, they were not the center of interest of the people gathered inside the buildings. In addition, none of the hearths found in Cyprus, Levant, and the Aegean during the 12th century BC bear any similarity in construction and form to the Palatial hearths. Monumental hearths like these found in the Megara in Mycenae, Tiryns, and Pylos were linked to a ceremonial and ritual ideology. They represent, though, a very limited sample of the hearths appeared in the Aegean area during the late Bronze Age. More modest hearths with no special treatment in their construction, even in central position, could have their very different meanings in a context inside or away from the palatial center or outside of the Aegean area. Their practical use as cooking installations and the light or heat source for the building could be of greater importance for their users. The social value of the hearth as a focal gathering point is not neglected, although it should not be taken as its only social dimension. This thorough analysis taking into consideration not only the central monumental hearths in central megaroid buildings and halls, but also smaller non-monumental hearths made possible a more comprehensive view of the hearth's meaning and use. Except from the debatable type of pebble hearths found mainly in Philistia, all the above-mentioned hearths found in Cyprus and Levant seem to have similar traits, with examples found in the Aegean already during the 14th, 13th, and early 12th century BC. What is more important, though, is that with the introduction of these hearths that poses certain characteristics, the related practice of cooking could have also altered, with a parallel introduction of Aegean-type cooking pots. The appearance of Aegean-type hearths should not be investigated as an isolated phenomenon, but as part of a whole set of material culture traits which are connected to certain habitual practices. The cause of this alteration, both in technological choices and habitual practices, is ranging from theories of migration to cultural imitation and technological transfer through other mechanisms. However, such a discussion is beyond the scope of this presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. You're whetting our appetites, I think, for hearths, cooking, and cuisine, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. But let's now turn to our next presentation, and this is by Kasia Dudlik and Piotr Zeman from Poznan University, and brings us right into the heart of the mainland, a tale of Mycenaean palatial town towards a narrative history of late Bronze Age Mycenae. So thank you, Piotr, for sharing the screen. Now it's full screen, and I give the floor to you too.
Thank you very much. Of course, first of all, we would like to thank all the organizers for the effort to organize this amazing event. Hopefully we can see each other in Warsaw soon, maybe in the next edition or before, hopefully. Today we would like to present some highlights from the recent research on the palatial town of Mycenae. So Mycenae plays a special role among the late Helladic settlements, being one of the largest and the most significant of the Mycenaean centers, affecting the entire Aegean culturally, but possibly also politically. In the last 20 years, a group of new archaeological contexts from the site was published, which together with a growing body of analysis of the material remains from the site, gives an opportunity to reanalyze its organization, architecture, and stratigraphic sequences, to formulate a few hypotheses about the history of the settlement. Our main theoretical approach for this paper is relational urbanism. It defines urbanism as a property of entire settlement system rather than individual sites. It is defined by the two main criteria: functional differentiation and specialization between sites of the settlement network, and second, urban sites showing significantly more developed internal differentiation than other sites in the settlement network. The urbanization is a process in which we can see growing functional and structural differentiation within the settlement network and inside its most prominent sites. We think that such a process can be seen on the Greek mainland during the late Bronze Age, when the rise of the Mycenaean palaces transformed regional settlement networks and allowed the formation of a new form of settlement that can be named palatial town. The latter consisted of a palace, a central authority occupying the elite core of the settlement, and a lower town. And this basic internal division is always archaeologically visible. Palace and the lower town form an entanglement of objects, people, buildings, and artifacts, with multiple internal and external relations, and were the key points of Mycenaean social, economic, and administrative systems in the regions dominated by palatial political economy. The first significant spread of the settlement at Mycenae occurs not earlier than in the early Helladic period. The following Middle Helladic phases are widely documented in the ceramic material from the summit and the mortuary remains from the prehistoric cemetery. Unfortunately, nothing precise about the architectural arrangement of the hill can be said. From the area outside the Acropolis, the concentration of the architectural remains have been found to the west. The most striking features of the transitional MH-LH period is a growth of wealth, apparent in the burial evidence of grey circles B and A. Advanced architecture, collective burials, sophisticated offerings, decorative grave stele, and finally walls separating grave circles from the surrounding burial ground. Those all clearly indicate the emergence of local elite. Starting from the LH2 period, The funerary landscape of Mycenae became dominated by extensive chamber tomb cemeteries surrounding the settlement, and the Tulus tombs, which symbolically can be perceived as landmarks of elite status. The elaborate architecture and more prominent location indicate that the tomb of Aegisthus and the lion tomb could have been built by the early Mycenaean rulers of Mycenae. The other monuments are regarded as tombs belonging to the local aristocracy. The building activity in the LH2 period spreads also next to the grave Silko A, where the constructed buildings were most likely of religious importance, connected with ancestral veneration. From the early Mycenaean period onwards, the formation of the palatial town developed gradually in a long process of creating various settlement zones through the development of occupational patterns. By the beginning of LH3, too, the landscape of Mycenae was reconfigured with the construction of the Mycenaean fortifications and first traceable palatial structure. A clear internal functional division of the settlement is thus reinforced. Introduction of linear B writing, appearance of specialized buildings, and establishment of a strict palatial zone. All those suggest that by LH3, too, the local elite accepted some traits of the Minoan palatial culture and gradually formed a new, more centralized political system. This process was probably related to a progressive hierarchization of the elite. Observable also is the changes in the use of Tulus tombs from the LH3A onwards. The most prominent tombs, Tomb of Aegisthus and later the Lion Tomb, were both remodeled and reused during this period. But except for those investments, the use of the form starts to be highly limited, both at Mycenae and in the entire Argolith. Another interesting pattern is observable in chamber tomb cemeteries. After the rapid expansion in LH2 period, the following phase brings only the constant development, suggesting more stable growth of this community at the end of the early Mycenaean period. During LH3 too, the palatial elite zone of residential, economic, administrative, and political functions were clearly isolated from the rest of the settlement, within which we can distinguish two other zones, funerary and cultic district that we call temenos, and the proper lower town. The temenos, which was largely set on the original Middle Helladic cemetery of Mycenae, was centered around the two Tulus tombs and the ancient shelf to grave Silkos. It was also, at least partially, surrounded by a wall, traces of which we can find west of the Aegisthus tomb. The sanctuary, known as the cult center, was being developed on the Acropolis west slope since LH3-1. The settlement definitely grew, and for the first time we have evidence for specialized, multifunctional structures in the lower town, although the question of palatial involvement in their economic activities remains open. The most important is Petsa's house, family residence with a pottery workshop, warehouse, and distribution center, originally constructed in LH3-1 and large and modified in LH3-2. Other architectural remains and domestic pottery deposits were located to the east, in the so-called museum area, and to the south on the Penake Ridge. Altogether, we have strong evidence that by the end of the LH3-2, Mycenae became a substantial settlement, occupying probably 13 hectares. The period ends with a widespread fire destruction, which most probably affected only the structures outside the fortified zone of LH3-2 period. In general, there are basically no examples of continuative, undisturbed stratigraphic sequences of LH3-2 and LH3-B1 in the lower town, which suggests some major destructive event in the history of the settlement between the two phases.
Okay, now let me take over this. So, from B1 now, the reaction to this event that Kasia was just speaking about, so the possible destruction of the lower town at the end of LH3-2, so the reaction was vigorous, as the next phase marks the peak of development of the palatial town. The temenos was much enriched through the construction of the tomb of Clytemnestra, monumentalization of Great Circle A, and construction of new buildings in the area, including rapid development of the cult center sanctuary. Due to those investments, a monumental facade was formed in front of the citadel wall, further emphasizing the special function of this quarter. Although contexts related to occupation, storage, and production of goods were also identified in the area. At the moment, the settlement reached a size of circa about 21 hectares. New multifunctional elite residences were constructed outside the walls, the best example being the well-known West House Group, an important economic and administrative center, probably with close ties to the palatial administration. A similar establishment might have existed around the Cyclopean Terrace building. Simpler, although still well-developed and equipped residences of middle class of specialized craftsmen or palatial dependents can be identified in the Museum area, the Plakes house, or in the Panagia houses complex. None of them, however, can be interpreted as truly houses of the poor, as was sometimes postulated in the literature. Those are absent from the material record excavated so far, although some people of the lowest social status, like non-specialized workmen, servants, or slaves, have freely lived inside the residences of their patrons. The period ends with a series of destruction. At the end of LH3B1, the West House Group, House of Fleet, and Cyclopean Terrace building complex were all burned and abandoned, and soon after, during LH3B2 early, a devastating earthquake, traces of which are traceable universally across the site, hit Mycenae. Now, after the earthquake, the response to the catastrophe resulted in a deep change in the organization of the settlement. The citadel's fortifications were expanded, and the palace gained the entire east wing with storerooms and workshops. Palatial warehouses, some of considerable size, were also constructed in the northwest and northeast quarters. A new sanctuary of House Mi appeared, possibly for partial replacement of the cult center, much damaged by the earthquake. The latter was still partially rebuilt and was now inside the citadel, as well as the monumentalized Grave Circle A and its surrounding structures. The access to the sanctuary was restricted and reoriented, as it became directly linked to the palace with the system of ramps, in an attempt to renegotiate the ritual space, as raised by Dr. Shelton in her keynote lecture just 2 days ago. The Temenos district was thus decomposed, with Tholos tombs cut off from the sanctuaries. This suggests a break in the development of the old elite funerary zone, further evidenced by the refuse material dumped around the tomb of Clytemnestra. This process can explain the need for establishing a new burial ground for the ruling family, with the construction of the largest Tholos in the Aegean, the treasure of Atreus. There are multiple arguments for its late dating, including fragments of LH3B pottery from below the threshold and remarkable similarity to Lion's Gate architecture. Most of the lower town must have been left in ruins after the earthquake, as there are very few examples of immediate reoccupation there. Some of the inhabitants probably moved inside the walls of the citadel, where new residential quarters appeared, most notably on the southwest slope. Most of the economic activities occurred within the citadel. Its elite character must have been blurred with the formation of internal districts of various character and specialized functions. It is difficult to reconstruct the overall size of the settlement at that period, but it was probably not more than 10 hectares. During this period, the main western wing of the palace was burned and then hastily rebuilt on an altered and slightly enlarged plan. After the initial rebuilding, it still went through some more alterations, some to be made at the very last moment before the end of the palatial period. The latter came at the end of the LH3B phase, with the widespread fire destruction that affected most of the buildings inside the citadel. The destruction, although it brought an end to the palace, did not result in a fall of the town, which remained very much alive. The fire which devastated the citadel did not spread to the structures that were still occupied in the lower town. Of those, Panagia houses suffered from fire sometime earlier, maybe at the time the first palace was burned, but were then yet again reoccupied. Together with the buildings of the museum area, they continued to be used until the end of LH3C early. During this period, some functional and structural divisions between the lower town and the citadel might have still existed, despite the loss of the palatial status by the latter. Some of the walls of the palace's east wing were used to construct a complex of buildings Psi and Omega, which might have played a central role during this period, resembling building T from Tidens. Some of the palatial warehouses were also still in use, and communication inside the citadel was facilitated with new roads. Although the cult center was now definitely abandoned and overbuilt by domestic structures, the Grave Circle A was probably still venerated. In LH3C middle, 2 new residential quarters were established behind the citadel walls, while some of the abandoned areas of the lower town started to be used for burials. This change of the occupational pattern turned out to be long-standing, as evidenced by later remains of the historical period. The Acropolis was also still occupied, but LH3C late, the settlement inside the walls had shrunk so much that the burials were set on the Acropolis for the first time since the early Mycenaean period. Moreover, almost all the buildings of the LH3C period can be characterized as independent housing units, although few structures of special functions and possibly public status were still in use inside the citadel, at least until the end of LH3C middle. The chamber tomb cemeteries continued to be utilized. However, an increase of simple graves can be noticed. The settlement suffered from repetitive fires. The most serious was probably the one at the end of LH3C middle, when all of the buildings on the western south slope of the Acropolis were destroyed. Although a slow decline of the settlement and loss of economic potential is apparent in the material record, it was still occupied by a lively, culturally active community, as evidenced, for example, by impressive examples of pictorial pottery. This overview of over 700 years of Mycenae's history will be now summarized and set in a broader context of Bronze Age argolith. It was recently suggested by Professor Maran that Mycenae was established as a new center in opposition to Argos as a result of a conscious choice of an emerging elite. This view is not universally accepted, and growing differentiation among burials developed gradually across the entire region. However, an explosion of wealth observed in shaft grave circles definitely suggests some major change. Moreover, in the later period of the early Mycenaean, in the later part of the early Mycenaean period, Mycenae became the largest settlement of the region, with rapidly growing cemeteries of chamber tombs and of various status, and a striking number of 6 tallus tombs built until the end of LH2. This dominant position was probably transferred into more direct political control only during LH3A, when palatial culture appeared in the argolith for the first time. Formation of urbanized settlement forms, construction of monumental residences, in both Mycenae and Tiryns, and fortifications also on those two sites, appearance of linear B writing, deep change in the distribution of valuables and use of tallus tombs on the regional scale, all suggest that this is the period when the argolith probably formed a single palatial state. By LH3B, the regional settlement network was well organized with a system of roads that we can see on the right here. And in this period, first part of LH3B, Mycenae experienced a peak of its development. Its key characteristic at the time were division of the settlement into multiple zones, social and economic dominance of the palace over the community, presence of multifunctional complexes, prevalence of gradually developed single-family residences outside the palatial zone, and finally mixing of residential and funerary zones, including the presence of elite tombs in the center of the settlement. However, it seems that already during the 13th century BC, some serious changes, possibly also of political nature, occurred. After destructions of the Middle LH3B, Mycenae started to shrink and its occupational patterns changed. Although the site probably still served as an important fortress, religious center, and a royal burial ground probably, the actual economic and possibly also political center of the region might have been transferred to Tiryns, which at this time experienced major expansion of its fortification and growth of the lower town. This hypothesis, brought up more recently by members of the Tiryns team, was in fact first formulated by Professor Lewartowski as early as 1995 in his PhD. Widespread destructions at the end of LH3B and fall of palaces almost certainly brought an end to the political unity of the region, but their exact nature and course of those destructions at the end of LH3B is still much debated, and it's uncertain how they developed. During LH3C, Mycenae experienced the decomposition of the palatial town, but it was a gradual process that took over 100 years and was accompanied by a deep change of the local socioeconomic and political systems. Tiryns, on the other hand, continued to grow, while its dominance over the region is further suggested by changes in the settlement network, which started to concentrate in the south. However, Mycenae was probably never completely abandoned after the Bronze Age, and later became one of the leading polis of the early Iron Age argolith. Thank you very much.
Kasia and Piotr, thank you so much for drawing together this huge evidence for urban processes in the argolith, and I think even beyond. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Now we come to Jorge Cano-Moreno and his paper on a political anthropology for NeoPalatial Crete. Jorge, you already are there and sharing your screen. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for accepting my presentation and for organizing as well this interesting Congress. And this work had its origin in informal conversations and more formal debates during my time in Heidelberg, thanks to a grant of the DAAD for PhD research. So I am very grateful to Maria Anastasiadou, Diamantis Panagiotopoulos, Diana Wolf, and all the staff for being so open during my stay. There, I intend to study the NeoPalatial seals and their context of production and consumption, as well as to analyze how seals had a certain agency in this context. But the first problem was to determine approximately what this content had been like, especially in political and economic terms. Obviously, we all know the model proposed by Evans, where Knossos was located at the top of the hierarchy and the remaining structures, palaces, villas, and towns were subordinated. This model has been criticized from different perspectives, since it reproduced a large number of commonplace typical of the European intellectual environment of the early 20th century and Evans itself. However, despite the criticism and congresses that were held to analyze many of the English archaeologists' proposals, I am referring to the Minoan thalassocracy, myth and reality, Minoan society, and the fusion of the Minoan palaces congresses, it was not until 1986 that Sherry proposed the first alternative model, the peer polities interaction. This alternative was based on the nascent territorial and landscape archaeology and on some anthropological concepts that were applied for the first time. The main idea of this work was to analyze the emergence of palaces during the proto-palatial period and the possible political interaction of this building during the NeoPalatial period. As new structures were palatial or not were discovered, this model began to lose validity, at least in its final form. However, many of the concepts introduced by Cherry continue to be applied nowadays to analyze the material reality of Crete. Thus, in 2002, Hamilakis proposed a much more dynamic alternative using the concept of factions. This theory had a long life in political anthropological studies, but in archaeology, it had only been applied by Broomfield and Fox to analyze social dynamics in Mesoamerica. In addition to focusing on social processes that went beyond palaces, Hamilakis used ethnographic evidence to understand different forms of human interaction and how this could be observed in the material record. However, it was not considered that the concept of faction was in constant revision by different anthropologists. Also, its use in the Aztec and Mayan area was not entirely accepted. In the same year, Dreesen began with a fruitful theoretical production, introducing different concepts related to the theory of Levi-Strauss, house societies. It's not my intention to reveal all this work, but to mention some important issues. First, in his approach, cooperative dynamics predominate over competitive ones. Second, the use of the concept houses leaves sufficient space for agency, practice, structuration, and interaction. And finally, he introduced the network and corporate strategies, following the work of Langton, also in the Mesoamerican area. Another interesting point in Dreesen's work is that he understands house society as an heuristic element and not as a definitive political model. However, as some participants in his last book explained, the long duration of the houses gives an essentialist character and does not explain its links with possible political scenarios. There are other ideas that I would like to address: the work of Parkinson and Galaty, the issue of chiefdom, and the possibility that Knossos might have been a cosmological center. But they deserve a more in-depth approach than I can give them in this presentation, so I will talk about it in the near future, I hope. I tried to make a chart to explain the evolution of these concepts and their link with Mesoamerican archaeology. But as I elaborated, I realized that it had gotten off of control. So sorry for these messy arrows. But if we concentrate on the lower part of the graphic, we can observe two striking things. First, in Renfrew's and Sherry books, we find the work of two archaeologists from the Mayan area who applied peer polities interaction model to propose new alternatives in their field of study. Second, from this publication on, Mayan archaeology was much more fruitful in proposing new models and its interdisciplinary relation with anthropology. The reason is simple. Mayan writing was almost totally deciphered in the 80s. And this is very important, it is still possible to do ethnographic work with surviving Mayan populations today. The curious thing is that from the year 2000, both fields of study met again through the influences that I have already mentioned, and for that reason, I want to highlight the particularities of Mayan political models. The intellectual development of both disciplines is almost parallel. First, there was a stage of ad hoc theories with an intuitive base and sustained from the evolutionary common sense. Later, the possibility of strongly centralized city-states and the existence of territorial states was proposed. As an alternative, decentralized models emerged, such as the peer politics interaction model and the galactic model, which I found very attractive, although it has already been partially overcome for the Mesoamerican area. The galactic model proposed a relationship between centers of power in the form of a mandala. That is, the different areas of certain cultural zone were connected following ideological parameters that were flexibly adapted to territoriality. It is the ideological representation of the world that prima over earthly reality. Next, the power lies in the performative possibilities of the leader, who must ensure the means to perform their rituals and who make a continuous display of their power, whether real or aspirational. From my point of view, that mechanic sounds very Minoan. Finally, the dynamic model proposed that the alternation between moments of centralization and decentralization. A simple idea, but it could be applied to the final phases of the NeoPalatial period. The conclusions that I am presenting are preliminary, since I am in the middle of this uncertainty, which is why this presentation seeks to be deliberately provocative in order to consider new paths. Starting at the end of my work, it is important to highlight the importance of cross-cultural comparison for analyzing ancient cultures. It will be interesting to include, for example, the societies of the Levant of the Iron Age, where there seem to be similar dynamics. Here in Latin America, pre-Columbian archaeology is part of our bachelor studies, so I found really appealing how this knowledge could be useful in order to study other cultures. I think it is important to take into account the intellectual origin of the concepts we apply, so as not to accept them uncritically. Also, could be worthy reintroduce anthropological ideas as patron-client interaction and the debate between chiefdom and state organizations from a non-evolutionary perspective. Even so, I believe that any model should be a hypothetical starting point to understand the complexity of the archaeological record. In other words, an epistemology heuristic device. This academic development has led to a resounding change. Power and power relations are considered in their social dynamics and not as an essential character owned by certain groups. Finally, as part of my research, I will intend to delve into the performative aspect of the galactic model during the NeoPalatial period and the possibility of analyzing how the seals are the product of this content and how, at the same time, they act on over it. Thank you.
Jorge, thank you very much, bringing us in a way full circle back to our theoretical assumptions and models. And thank you all speakers in the session for perfectly keeping in time, actually leaving us more time to discussion. And with this, I want to open the floor to everybody. If you have, we will of course start first with Georgios Stergiou's paper. Feel free to raise your hands or write a question in the chat. And if there is at the moment no question immediately for Georgios, I may actually. Oh yeah, Georgia Filipaiki.
Sorry, I arrived at the last minute. I have a question for Georgios. First of all, of course, I would like, it's good. I can speak?
Yes.
Okay. I would like to congratulate Georgios for this very specific paper about the lithic assemblages of the northern and southern Greece. And I would like to ask Georgios, could you specify the origins of your assemblages and the type of sites? Because we have not an idea about they are domestic, they are funeral lithic assemblages, and could you specify also the quantities you have studied, and if there are differences between northern and southern Greece in these two questions, please?
First of all the material, the archaeological material, comes from domestic contexts, not funerary. And there are many sites. These are just some sites that I want to give a picture about the lithic assemblages and the differences between north and south. There are also other sites such as Asyros, Kastanasi, Central Macedonia that I studied this period, and others such in Karditsa, in Epirus, in Palabouti, and other sites that are still in the study is still in progress. So these were the preliminary results of my PhD.
Okay, and the sites are important sites excavated recently. You have other architectural remains?
In most sites, yes, especially in Central Macedonia, there are architectural remains at Tubat, Asyros, at Agios Mamas in Chalkidiki. In Western Thessaly and Epirus, not so much. We don't have any architectural remains, but these are mostly Middle Bronze Age sites in Western Thessaly and Epirus, and also the sites in Central Macedonia.
Thank you, Jorge. There's a question by Polina Kapsali. Are you there, Polina?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Hello, Giorgio.
Hello.
Giorgio. Very nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
I would like to ask you if you observe a differentiation in the function of objects produced in obsidian and other raw materials, for example, dirt at Plasi and Kira. This is my first question, and my second question is: you referred to a special tool, type of tool, so a sickle element that it is produced at the end of the 3rd millennium.
Yes.
And as I understood, you related it to the introduction of new agricultural practices. So do you think that this type of object of a tool is produced for the first time at the end of the 3rd millennium? And do you think that it relates to new agricultural practices, to the introduction of new agricultural practices in the mainland?
Okay, thank you. About the sickle elements, yes, we have I think it is an innovation. It is another discussion, but I think it is an innovation in the end of the 3rd millennium BC. In the Neolithic times, sickle elements were nabbed on large-sized blades with a little retouch on the edges, and at the end of the 3rd millennium, these are substituted by sickle elements on flakes with serrated edges and covering retouch. So it is, and this, I believe these sickle elements were hafted together and fitted in wooden sickles perfectly. So it is another, I think it is another technology. It is another type maybe of wooden sickle. So I believe it is something new, but it is another discussion. It's thank you.
Yeah,
and about Kira and Plasi, usual analysis is not a part of my PhD. So I don't. I only study the typological and technology in this site. So I cannot answer the question of maybe differences.
We have
Okay, thank you very much, and congratulations again.
There's a question from Sofia Stosgale and also then of Susi Mercoliano. So Sofia, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am fascinated by your comparisons, realistic comparisons. I think it's work which hasn't been very often done, and it's really very important. One question which occurs to me is you see these imports from Milos and from the Aegean. Is it mainly because this is where actually the best material was at the time? But the other question is how far north the Emilian obsidian traveled? Has any of it been found in Bulgaria, in the Balkans, for example? Do you have any idea how did that happen?
In the sites of Macedonia, I'm finding pieces of obsidian, but 2 pieces, maybe 3 in a site, and not more. In Western Thessaly and Typiros, I haven't found any pieces of obsidian. Just I think 1 or 2 in Rachis Mascholouriou, in a site in a late Bronze Age site in Western Thessaly. And yes, obsidian goes until the northern Greece, but not in much quantities in these sites.
So you think that it's sort of disappearing Emilian obsidian towards the north, and it just doesn't cross the Rhodope and doesn't
yes, it almost disappears. It almost disappears. And I think that the main, as I said in the presentation, the main area that is active in the distribution and procurement of obsidian is the eastern part, Eastern Thessaly, Eastern Central Greece, Eastern Peloponnese, the coastal sites of this area, and Cyclades and Crete, of course.
Yeah, because the closest one. So we have the main circle of sort of, yeah. Okay.
Yes. And they're embedded in the maritime travels. And
yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
There's another question by Susi Mercoliano.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation. And I'm studying a Middle Bronze Age village in Achaea, the Trapeza village, and we do have a few pieces of obsidian instruments, mostly blades, and I was wondering whether this could have arrived already as finished products, but then during the excavations we also found a core. So I think, would you interpret this as a convincing proof that obsidian was traveling as rough material? Could you say something about the traveling of obsidian, if it was already as rough in finished products? And yes, and then the network. Do you think that there were direct connections, or maybe a network so that was like a passage from site to site and then arrived in the western regions? And as far as I remember, I think that also some analysis have been conducted in Albania, and there is obsidian from Melos, and they, in this case, they could have also at least accessed to the obsidian of Lipari. I mean, it isn't so as far as Melos, but they have obsidian from Melos. So maybe there was a network, a precise network from east to the west. Could you say something? Thank you.
Of course, yes. In the main area in eastern central Greece, Cyclades and Crete, production of obsidian was done inside the settlements. We find cores, we find some other pieces we call splinted pieces, which are exhausted cores, in fact. Cortical flakes with cortex, and of course tools and blades and flakes and many flakes. But in northern Greece, in Thessaly, in other parts of Greece and other regions, the products are finished. I mean, we don't usually find the cores and other pieces that show that production was done inside the settlement. But it's very interesting that you found a core in this site. Yes, it's from a single phase, or from what is the context of?
The context is a surface of a transitional middle to late Bronze Age phase, and this surface had some infant burial, so we assume that it was like a peripheral zone of the settlement that was specifically used for as a burial area for infants.
Okay, nice.
Very short question from my side, if I may. You mentioned at Plazi that chert only constitutes 3% of the lithic assemblage. And then you said that chert may have been used in phases when obsidian wasn't available. Can you very shortly elaborate that? Do you have some stratigraphic or contextual evidence that there are phases where phases of reduction or so in the habitation?
No, it's just an assumption that I made. In order to say that we have a million obsidian in 97% and 3% of chert have to be justified because it might be a shortage of obsidian in some period of time, and so I suppose that they used chert flakes, local chert, in order to compensate this shortage in some period of time. But at Plazi, it's a single phase. It's at the mid. The Megaron is dated at the Middle Helladic period. So I believe in just some period of this time, maybe they had a shortage of obsidian, so they used just local chert, just some flakes they found, and used them in order to have some activities inside the settlement.
Okay, you don't see like spatial differentiation.
No spatial.
Showing somehow
no.
lithic traditions. No. Okay, yeah, thank you. Let's move on to the next presentation by Dimitris. And Jorgo, thank you again, and also all participants for the discussion. Is there a question for Dimitris? Let me quickly see if no, I don't see any raised hands. So perhaps I may start again and you please just raise your hands or join. Dimitris, you pointed out that the variety in hearth construction also has to do with different cultural traditions of cooking and cuisine. Could you perhaps elaborate on that slightly in reference? You mentioned cooking pots. There's also often the discussion on the archaeological assemblages from the sites that we see evidence for a Western, let's say only Western or Northern influence in some of the Philistine assemblages. How do you, or what would you say to the practices actually connected to the different types of hearths, practices of cooking and relatedly and very indirectly of cuisine?
Yes, if I understood well, you mean if there is some connection between the zooarchaeological evidence in Philistia with the pigs who were coming from the Europe. Yes, probably there is some connection because in most of the Philistine sites, like Askelon and Asdod and Gath, there are changes in the cuisine in general, not only in hearths and cooking pots. There is a general change the cooking traditions. But as for the northern Levant and Cyprus, pretty much such studies are missing till this day. For example, in Tel Kazel or Tel Sukat, such studies are missing, and the examples that I presented are just some examples that I extracted from the information of the preliminary reports. I mean, the excavators did not mention any connection, did not refer to any connection between the Aegean type hearths and these specific examples.
Yeah, and
yes, yes.
And would you see, you pointed out that there's already forerunners for pebble hearths and also sherd hearths, especially on Crete in the Palatial period. How would you, quantitatively, how would you see the shift? Because of course, sherd or sometimes also pebble hearths are much more widely spread in the post-Palatial period. Would you see this as specific cooking practices which become more widespread in the post-Palatial, or would you say it's rather connected to social practices of hearths, of sharing hearths in open spaces or so? Do you?
The hearths in the Palatial period in mainland Greece and Crete, with shared bed or pebble bed or framed hearths with also bed made of stones and sherds. There are some examples. They are not so widespread, but there are pretty few examples in Chania, in Korakou, in Tiryns, in Methana, in Agios Konstantinos site. Of course, in late Helladic 3C period, or late Minoan 3C period, they become more widespread, of course, but the main point that I would like to emphasize is that the layout of these hearths and the practice of cooking was exactly the same. I mean, there was a platform either laid with clay or a clay with a bed of sherds, or just sherds or just pebbles. It was just the surface or an enclosure where the firing was taking place. So the basic concept behind this hearth was the same in mainland Greece, in Crete, and also in many examples in Cyprus, in northern Levant, and in Philistia, of course.
Thank you. I would think we have still time for, no, we have time now only time to move to the next presentation. Are there any questions for Kasia and Piotr? I don't see, Stephanie raised her hand. Stephanie.
Hi, thanks you two. I think that was it was a really good presentation. Obviously, I was going to have to ask a question, but actually I'm going to start with a comment and ask whether either of you two saw the paper that was given a couple of months ago by Nicholas Blackwell talking about the building of the treasury of Atreus, because I have to say that I thought that what he said about the chronology of the treasury of Atreus was very, very convincing. And therefore, I would be inclined to think that it's probable that the treasury of Atreus was built before the tomb of Clytemnestra. Sorry to bore everybody else in this discussion, but if you go with Nicholas Blackwell's chronology for the treasury of Atreus, is that causing your model a problem, or does that just mean you have to sort of like rejig things very slightly?
I think I can take it, right, Kasia? Because I saw the lecture. I saw the lecture. So maybe first, if it causes us any troubles, not really. This is a detail, really, because even for him and for basically anybody who researches Atreus for now, they all agree that there was a later reuse, and there is a late, very late, probably 3v2 use of the tomb. And Nicholas Blackwell thinks that this is a phase 100 years after the initial construction with the remodeling of the facade. And obviously this is a hypothesis. I mean, I was not convinced. I think that the material from below the threshold is an evidence of the strength that cannot really be weakened by any other study. To be honest, the material from the sherds from below the threshold that are of LH3b date, I know they are not that late, they are of general LH3b date, but for me,
the threshold, sorry to cut in, but the threshold stones can be taken out at any time. They're not positioned in such a way that it would fundamentally make the thing fall down if you pulled them out. So they would have been able, or we don't even know if that was the original threshold in that case.
So here, I mean, okay, obviously this is, you know, we could basically make a whole discussion only about this case. I knew that this was controversial, but was going to push in the presentation for this anyway, because that's my strong belief for now. But about the threshold, Weiss in his reports from the Treasury states that the threshold was in its original state and wasn't touched before he excavated it, that there were no signs of any intervention there, and that's why I doubt the hypothesis that the remodeling went so far to even touch the threshold. I do think that it is possible that there were multiple phases of the tomb, but I doubt that there would be any need to touch the threshold. And I think from the structural point of view, you know, if there were doors installed, it could actually be problematic. I mean, I'm not saying it's impossible, but it would be completely illogical to touch it. Why would they touch the threshold to build a new facade or do anything around it? But we could continue by email, I guess. I don't want to focus the discussion on the Atreus. But the main answer, if it is a problem for us, not really. We can agree for Nicholas Blackwell hypothesis too.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there other questions for Kasia and Piotr, especially, let's say, on the long-term perspective of the development of Mycenae? None from the audience. I would, if I may, just a very quick question. You argued that you see evidence in Mycenae that by the end of the Palatial period, it really took a dip down, and perhaps that even Turin's may have become the main, let's say, political actor in the Argolid. How would you see the place of Medea during this latest phase in the Argive plain?
You mean the last phase of the Palatial period?
Yes, later 3b, too late.
So, you know, there are multiple possibilities here, and I know that's why we were pretty general in our presentation, not to went into any deep interpretations on this, because I think there are possibly Medea, fortification of Medea is a sign of the same process that happens here. And although we suggested that Athens is becoming the political center of the region, there is a question if political unity of the region is still a thing in the late 3b, and then fortification of Medea can actually further push us into thinking that maybe all those centers are becoming more independent. But obviously, it's only a hypothesis here.
Yeah, thanks. I think we could discuss that for nights on end. I've already 3 questions for Jorge, to whom we turn now. The first one has been related by Maria Anastasiadou. She would like to ask you, Jorge, first of all, she says, thank you for the new insights. You're trying to bring Aegean archaeology with evidence from, bring to Aegean archaeology evidence from Mesoamerica. Can you please elaborate more on how specifically you intend to move about using the evidence from NeoPalatial seals in order to try to illuminate the issue of the political organization of the island?
Yes, well, thank you for the question. It is quite complicated to give a concise answer, but I think that the NeoPalatial seals are important in two ways. First of all, they are expressing a new stylistic iconographical idea. And then there is a really important relationship between motive and administration between the sides. So maybe the answer, I will explore the answer taking into consideration how can we use seals in order to reconstruct some kind of symbolic expression of that society. At the same time, how the seals have a special agency over the society. Well, she's totally familiar with the work of Anderson about the parallel lion. And I really like that approach because she is all the time working between these two between the context and seals. There is a really intense communication between these objects, and I would like to apply that insight in my research. When I went to Heidelberg, I select over 1,000 seals in order to be studied and how they can be related. So it is a really interesting work to do, actually.
Thank you. There's another question from Sophia Stowe-Scale.
Hello. Thank you very much. I must say I don't know much about Mayan archaeology, but I'm rather puzzled because there seem to be quite a lot of economic differences between Mayan society and Mycenaean society. Mycenaean society was the political economy was very much reliant on trade, particularly trade in metals, because the power of the palaces was in weapons. For these weapons, they needed copper and tin, which had to be imported. They also imported silver, gold. Everything was imported from overseas. There seemed to be no parallel to that in the Mayan society. The metal, as far as I know, was not much used for tools and weapons, but maybe I'm mistaken. So how do you see these parallels?
Well, thank you for your question. I am not a Mayanist either. I read about and models, political models, and I found this kind of inspiration in Mesoamerican models. But even these kind of differences, my idea is to approach this problem taking into consideration the interaction through some sociologic or anthropologic concept. In terms of economic, I didn't talk about how the trade or the redistributive model was challenged for the Minoan area. But I would like to add that the Mayan context is really economic, had a lot of dynamics in terms of trade. Maybe metals are not so important, but they are all the time doing really interesting connections with other parts of Mesoamerica. For example, Teotihuacan, that was the example quoted by Chef Results for the Cosmological Center, was really important in terms of ideological goods for the elite legitimization in Mayan politics. So there are trade. I know that ecologically are really different, the societies, but this kind of behavior, of social behavior, are in some way, I would say, analogous. It's not the same behavior, obviously, but they have really a lot of things in common. And this kind of models or approaches is a really good way to realize or be aware about these kind of connections, of social connections between different cultures. I use here the Mayan example because the academics use the Mayan example, but it could be interesting to introduce, for example, I dug in the Andes, and there is obviously a lot of peak sanctuaries. So it will be interesting also to see this kind of social dynamics in this context. It's not my intention to say that they are the same, but how they work in these ancient states or societies of political organization. So I think that could be a really interesting field to explore.
Thank you very much. I'm sure someone will follow it up.
Yeah, there's actually, I must say, a last question, but from Anastasia Verireiki to you, Jorge. Can you both keep it rather short? Thank you.
Hello, Jorge. Congratulations for your presentation. I just needed some clarifications because I'm very interested in social and political organization of Minoan and Crete. It's also my main research interest. So I've always thought that cross-cultural comparisons are a little bit problematic. For example, Ex Oriente Lux and stuff like that. Which caused us a great deal of distress and misunderstandings. However, there can be helpful in some cases. So what I wanted to ask you is whether you're going to use seals as an iconography. Are you going to study the iconography of seals and find similarities, reach conclusions regarding social organization? A little more information regarding your methodology.
Okay, thank you very much. I was hoping this kind of question because I prepare a slide and then I say, well, I will be the last presentation, so I erase it totally. I read a lot about cross-cultural comparison methodology. There is a lot of really interesting epistemological approach. Really, at the 18th, is really interesting from a philosophical point of view. I can send you the PDF if you are interested. And I also use for my research Norman Schoffey approach, trigger approach, and actually there is something interesting about cross-cultural comparison that probably most of the archaeologists use it, but they use it almost like intuitive. So I don't want to do that. I wrote about the cross-cultural comparison. As I say, I erased that slide in order to keep the presentation short, but it's really interesting, not only the comparison between cultures, but also the ethnographic information in order to understand the archaeological record, the nowadays ethnographic information, investigation. In the Mayan culture is really important because they have the Mayan population living there. Also in the Andes studies are really, really interesting. It's another different, it's a really different way to, sorry. And about the seeds, my main idea is not seeing if they are using the same motif in one culture and another. I am interested in terms of performances, public displays, and how these performances and public displays as the galactic model states were important in order to construct the power, and how they were operating between elites, regional elites, and between the elites, primary, well, elites and secondary elites, how they were using these seals in order to explain this common Minoan culture motives. So that is my intention.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jorge. Thank you so much to all the participants, all the session papers. I mean, for me, it was a great experience, because if I draw it together, I think we really had long-term perspectives, but not only long-term perspectives, but it was a session which had like really varied approach. We brought lithics to the forefront, which are very often really a background scatter, unfortunately. We had focuses on cultural practices, which are not only to my heart, but also to my belly, cooking and cuisine. We had the urban discussion for the Mycenaean mainland and the, let's say, regional approaches to urbanization. And we had a reflection on our modeling and theory. So I think we've really covered a lot of ground. Thank you, everyone. I'm looking forward to the next session, but now everybody is, I think, waiting for a very well-deserved coffee break. And I give Stephanie the floor for some.
Thanks, Melissa. That was a brilliant job guiding us through all of those very variable papers, so many different types of long-term trajectories that were being looked at there. And I think, again, another amazing session. We're blessed with the presenters this year. It is absolutely fantastic. The discussion has gone over a bit because there was a lot to discuss. So I think if we try and give everybody the proper 20-minute coffee break so that everybody can get sufficiently refueled for the very last push. And if we can all try and get back here at, what would it be, 20 to 4, then I think that would be good. Also, just to warn you, we may have to do a couple of sound tests during the break. So if your computer suddenly starts making noises, please ignore us. We're just testing something. So thank you again. See you all soon in about 20 minutes time.